which through the scrog, you've eliminated any of that de-leafing that a lot of people, including myself, that a lot of people do in that bottom 2 feet of canopy.
It's just a different style, and it was the style that I was taught. So what my buddy G taught me is, everyone's growing these big plants and then trying to just get these massive top colas at the top. But there's a lot of time getting that plant to that size before, and then you got to lollipop everything on the bottom. And I lollipop stuff too once I get them in there to a certain height, because
we're Jug Dealers, we're the podcast you need in your feed, teaching the game like you never seen. Jerin, Gabe, GRAMBO, true OGs, masters of the globe, set your mind free. From Denver, Colorado, where the dead is green, we set the data points for the SOPs. Jug Dealers Podcast, yes indeed.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Jug Dealers Podcast, where we discuss all things cannabis and lifestyle related, brought to you by the good people at 5-8 and available at jugdealers.net and jugdealers.shop. Today, we are here with someone very special, a buddy of mine whose hash I have been smoking for a long time, but he's kind of unique. Today we have in studio the Diamond Mine. Welcome to the studio.
Thank you guys very much for having me.
Oh yeah. He's unique in the fact that, as far as I know, he's the only living single source, living soil BHO guy I know. So we're going to get into some of the personal background, some of the living soil practices first, because I think that's something that's really interesting. As we were talking about before the show, living soil has been kind of all the rage nowadays. And if you smoke good, well-grown living soil flower, you see why, because it's awesome. But obviously, as I always say, great flower makes great hash. And, this is probably going to be a two-parter. So on the second part, we're going to discuss BHO, but we're going to actually get into like why BHO is so good for some of these hash extractions. We're going to talk about cannabis and soil interaction, challenges and solutions, sustainability, advice and vision, and then some of your personal reflection, because you've been doing it, even though you're kind of a younger guy, you've been doing it quite a while. It's funny seeing you come in. Like, you grew up in Denver, you used to skate with some of the homies here.
Yeah. I actually grew up in Boulder, and that's where this whole journey kind of took off. So
hell yeah. Well, let's start off. I mean, right off the rip, 58 turns in the same soil. What inspired you to start growing cannabis and choose living soil as your method, bro?
So I kind of lucked out on the living soil aspect of things. Like I said, I grew up in Boulder. I went to welding school down here in Denver. I was planning on being a welder. Mm-hmm. Life had other plans for me. So while I was in welding school, I was slanging eights and stuff like that to all my friends just to pay my bills and do everything while I was going to school. And my plug just started bringing worse and worse and worse weed to the point where the last time he showed up, I was like, dude, I can't even sell this. This is garbage. And it was strange finding a hard time to find good weed in Boulder, because
Boulder's always been the home of
exactly. So one of my friends came into town that I hadn't seen since I was 15, and we reconnected, and I was talking to him about the issues that I was having, and he was like, I have a family friend that I'd like to introduce you to. And so I was, of course, open to it. He happened to live 5 minutes down the road from me. He was an OG dude. He was doing this stuff 30 years before I was.
Nice.
So
he's an old head.
Yeah. And so I went over to his house. Me and him were just on the same page. We just connected immediately. And I was over at his house every other day after that. And we became really good friends fast. And he taught me everything. He taught me the clones first, how to grow clones well and take clones and cuts and do all that. And then eventually brought me into the flower room and taught me that whole system as well. So within about 2 months, he taught me everything that he knew.
And what style was he growing?
Living soil.
Living soil?
Yeah. And his beds were, the first grow house that I inherited from him, I grew in for 10 years, and it was a grow house 15 years before I got in there.
So you're talking like 25-year-old
25,
soil.
same dirt.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and that's to this day, that was the best soil I've ever grown in my entire life.
That is crazy.
Yeah.
That is crazy. Talk about your journey through the cultivation, like how you kind of evolved from that to where you're at now.
So, it's been the exact same. So I've been doing this.
You use same method that you learned originally.
Yeah. I've peppered in a couple new ingredients, products that came out here and there, but really didn't see too much benefit from what I was already doing. So I've just kind of stuck with with everything that I learned from the get-go.
When you moved, do you like bring the beds around with you? Or?
So my friend who taught me how to grow weed, he wasn't in the best health and he passed away like 6 years ago, I think. And his family ended up like selling those houses and all those spots. But at the same time, when that happened, I got my own place. So where my spot was I had free reign in the basement. It was unfinished. And I built 2 rooms and a veg room down there, exactly how I wanted.
2 flower rooms?
Yeah, 2 flower rooms.
What's your setup that you run down there?
So they're 5x5 beds. They're a foot deep. They have grassroots fabric pots in them where the sides are not breathable, but the bottoms drain. So what they call them, they're living soil beds, I think. So those are what are in, and then I welded the grow tables themselves.
Oh, nice.
So
you got like rolling tables.
Yeah, they're custom rolling tables, and then that liner just slips in there and then it's filled with dirt.
And I found your Instagram here. You got some solid canopy work, my friend. These are,
we were going to talk about, it is
just like a carpet of canopy.
So if you go down, if you scroll down towards the very bottom, I'll show you that spot go up in the middle, one above that one, up.
One more. Up.
Yeah, one more up. That one. Okay. So that was the first house that I grew in, and those were the beds that were 25 years old.
Gorgeous.
Yeah. So, and those beds were a little smaller. They were 4x4s, and we put 5 plants, I think, in each one in each corner, and then one in the center to kind of fill things out.
So for our listeners, what exactly is living soil and how does it differ from like the normal methods of like that a lot of people are doing, most people are doing, which is like rock wool. Back then I was doing hydroton and bucket and the aquafarm buckets, but what really makes it different? I think a lot of people just look at it and they think to themselves, oh, it's dirt. You know what I mean? But like, that's a pretty generic term in the fact that what you do is totally different. So maybe explain to our listener, what's the difference between dirt and living soil?
So the living soil we try and cultivate over the years. So we start with just dirt, but we add microbes. There's living bacteria in there. I put earthworms in every bed. So like we're really trying to mimic nature as much as possible, although it's indoor artificial. So and that's kind of like the difference from just an inert media like rock wool or cocoa, where it's much more important to have dialed what it is that you're feeding that plant, because there's no the soil acts as like such like a buffer for all the nutrients are in there. The plants grab what they want, they kind of leave what they don't want. And then the big thing is just the microbes. And now we're starting to use all these, the plant extracts and ferments and all that stuff too. So you're really just trying to build the best base that you can for these plants.
Excellent. So, I think that's one of the things where, we talk a lot about on the show about, I'm a big hater of hypochlorous acid. I'm constantly kind of bashing it because, but at the same token, I like synthetics, and I tell people all the time, like, you can use them together. Like you can use synthetics with bacillus and glomus and all these different bacteria and mycorrhiza. Just don't use hypochlorous that kills all that stuff. You know what I mean? But either way, like they're going to help with nitrification and stuff like that. So like the process is the same. So I think that's one of the things where living soil just takes it all the way as far as like, are most of the amendments you use organic?
Yeah. So at the beginning of every round, I use a dry amendment, which is like the secret recipe that was passed down. But all of the dry amendments are organic.
They're all still available. They haven't. None of the companies haven't.
One of the things that we used to use was a stuff called Magamp, and they went out. I don't know. I looked into it. I couldn't find why they went out of business, but I guess that was one of the ingredients that was synthetic that we had in our top coat. That was a slow release magnesium and nitrogen. and orchid growers used it. It was like huge, I guess, for orchid growers. But over the years, it something happened to it. They had a plant in Texas and they stopped making it.
Yeah, it happens. It's funny because we, as you know, with the new millennium, like we make our own stuff, and it really, you see things get mined up, you know?
Yeah, totally.
So how do you maintain, healthy soil and a thriving microbiome in your soil?
So for me, the magic is really the recipe that we use. So like the top coat, like all the top dress amendments are what makes us able to just keep reusing the soil over again, because whatever the plants uptake during the cycle, we replenish at the beginning of each round.
And because you have such a shallow bed, it eventually will kind of leach into the bed and kind of break down.
With every water, it kind of soaks in more and more and gets down into the soil. That
makes sense. Yeah, that shallow bed really helps. You use cover crops, I assume?
Nope.
No, you don't. And that's right, because you do something pretty wild. And if you look on his page, you'll see that you actually and this is an old school technique, but you're like the master of the scrog.
Yeah.
I mean, to put it lightly, because, for those of you, most people nowadays, they just use the trellis netting and they grow up through it and they go, kind of 3 feet of canopy, let's say 3.5 feet of canopy. Whereas you really take your plants and lay them out so that all of a sudden, all those inside branches are kind of coming up. Do you want to speak to that as far as some of your methodology?
So that is one thing that I've been tweaking over the years. So when I first was taught that, we really only like thinned the plant like 6 weeks. So like the last couple weeks, we would go in there and thin all the fan leaves. And then as the evolution of lights really. So when we switched, I've been going under LEDs now for like 3 or 4 years. So fairly new to them compared to the HPS. And the one thing that I noticed with the LEDs is they make the plants throw leaves like crazy. So to the point where like I'm thinning.
So you were growing the same genetics. You switched them over to LEDs and all of a sudden the morphology is different.
Crazy.
In which you're seeing a lot more.
Yeah.
Less biomass and more like leaf material.
So in noticing that and seeing the difference, it took a little bit, but I started the thinning program differently.
Did you make what adjustments did you make to your environment to kind of help mitigate those issues? My
environment's pretty dialed because I'm in basements. So I don't use ACs. I don't use dehues. I don't use humidifiers. I just have fresh air come in and old air go out, scrubbers. So depending on the time of year, I have things toggle on and off. So like a lot less scrubbing with stuff out when it's cold. And then summertime, everything's like full blast. But in doing that, I'm able to keep my room a pretty consistent 78, 80 degrees all year round, no matter what's going on. So, so that aspect of things has been pretty dialed. I had to ramp the heat up a little bit more with the LEDs.
Yeah, I'm usually running my rooms at like 84 until the end, and then I kind of bring it down at the end. Totally, but but again, part of that is having your CO2 right, all the rest of that stuff. How do you manage pests and stuff like that in your garden? So
the biggest way to do that is just to not let them in the first place. So it's like my whole regimen is just keeping the clone room clean. You can get rid of stuff using nasty stuff if you get like spider mites or root aphids or something like that. I've had that in past in other spots, and not my new one, which is, it's 10 years old now, but you really just want to keep them out and like your veg as clean as possible so that you don't have to deal with that in your
flower. When you bring in new genetics, mostly from seed, or are you quarantine it? What's your quarantine process?
Quarantine them and check the roots. And then if it's bad or I see something, you can do a dunk or just spray, and they stay in their own corner away from everything else. But a lot of the people that I get clones from are on the same regimen as I am. So I trust that that their stuff's clean, but you have to just put everything into quarantine.
And bro, you got some super cool stuff in the arsenal. I've smoked a decent amount of it, and it's all Sour D, the Red Pop Runts, which is just, we'll talk about it later, but it's one of those flavors where like, that's kind of your you're like, is this really cannabis flavor?
A lot of people have called me out for it being
they've been like botanical terps. And you're like, no, it's not botanical terps, dude. I get it.
Yeah.
What are some of the amendments that you're into using as far as like compost teas, worm casting, some organic inputs? Like what are some of the tips that you would maybe pass on to some other folks?
So I don't use teas, but for the top coat that we use, there's a lot of different recipes that you can find online and come up with yourself. But most of the stuff that we use are all pretty generic things. It's we use earthworm castings, bat poop, seabird poop. It's mostly a lot of poops.
Yeah.
And then what else we got in there? We got blood meal, bone meal.
And you got to be real careful about the timing on when you apply that stuff. Cause I know with the bone meals, I've had a problem with them really being able to rinse out of the plants.
Mm-hmm. So the thing that I found works best for when I do a batch for the round is I put all of the amendments in a cement mixer that I got at Home Depot, and it mixes everything really good. Just let it run for like 20 minutes.
Nice.
And then each one of my beds gets about 8 cups. So once that mix is all met up, 8 cups on the bed, and then I lightly till it in there.
Yeah, I saw that. You kind of, I was noticing you got the little garden weasel. Yep.
So, and like, it's just light, just so it gets in there.
Just so you get it under that top coat and it'll be able to kind of rinse its way in. Yep. Do you use RO'd water? Do you use filtered water?
No, just tap water.
Tap water.
Yeah.
Do you oxygenate it, let it dechlorinate or anything? By the way, it's funny because I don't really do a lot of that stuff either. Like I pretty much, I'll leave an air stone in mine for like a couple hours, and I think that helps dechlorinate some of it. But like beyond that, no, I'm with you. I pretty much.
So there's a company called Magnation, and I do have those things on all my water lines, and they're pretty sick.
What does that do?
So they have a bunch of different products, but the fancy top tier one that I like, I forget what like the actual name of it is, but essentially you put it on your water line, and it has inside it's got like a spiral, so it like. Forget what the term is for it, but like it makes the water like softer essentially.
Okay.
And then it going through the magnets, it dissolves like buildup that's already in your water line.
Okay.
So
that's interesting.
And a bunch of people were like, that's a bunch of hippie
dude,
bullshit.
pro tip right there. Yeah. I had never heard of that.
Yeah. So I have city water, which is pretty good, but we had well water and it worked great with the well water as well.
Is there a filter that you have to change out? No,
you just change the magnet. And I think they're good for 15 years.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, and here's where I do know that it does work. So the place that we had before that was on a well, mineral water. It was hard mineral water, and on our sprayer heads on the watering grates that we had, they'd clog up often. So like every round when we would be wetting the beds down, we'd be going through and having to change out so many of these sprinkler heads because they were just clogged with minerals. When the magnets got on there,
none of that stuff.
A couple each round that you have to switch out versus like tons of them. So it does work for sure.
How often are you kind of top dressing throughout the cycle?
Just once.
Just once?
At the beginning.
Do it right at the beginning and then that's good for the entire round.
As you can see on the photos, like once I get the plants laid out by like, I try to do it by week 4. You can't even, you can't get.
You're not moving.
It's literally one of the more, we deal with cannabis people day in, day out in my world. This is some of the tightest canopy I've ever seen. Dude.
And how many plants are in that bed? Like 6?
Yeah.
Holy crap. It looks like 30.
6, like they were probably like that big.
Yeah. Wow. How long do you veg for?
4 days.
Yeah.
So when the plants are growing in like my veg, it's 5 weeks, it's like good 2 weeks to get roots and then probably 5 weeks to get them like, solid plant like that.
Yeah.
And then from there, 4 days in the bed.
4 days in the bed, you scrog them out.
And so then I call it directionalizing. So the first one is I get
you're anti-scrog?
No, I'm not anti-scrog, but like I get the arms in like the direction that I want them to go to fill the space out and then let them do their thing. So once they get to, with my style, at least once they get to like, 1.5 feet or so, is when I'll do the thinning on them and then pinning them down.
And you couldn't even get under canopy lighting in there if you wanted.
Nope.
And not for nothing, you're pretty much utilizing every single bud site in which through the scrog, you've eliminated any of that de-leafing that a lot of people, including myself, that a lot of people do in that bottom 2 feet of canopy.
It's just a different style, and it was the style that I was taught. So what my buddy G taught me is, everyone's growing these big plants and then trying to just get these massive top colas at the top. But there's a lot of time getting that plant to that size before, and then you got to lollipop everything on the bottom. And I lollipop stuff too once I get them in there to a certain height, because I don't want to have anything underneath the watering grates. So that's kind of like my baseline. It's like where the watering grates are at, which is pretty much just level with the top of the bed. I thin everything up to that. And then we'll directionalize them. And then once they hit the jump and start going, that's when I'll come in there with the first heavy duty de-leafing and then pinning.
What's the size of your squares?
There's no squares.
It's not squares?
No. So I use 2-foot bamboo stakes and landscape staples, 8-inch landscape staples.
Okay, I'm seeing it now. Now that you say that, I thought that was just scrog lines, but so you have directional, like almost poles laying down.
Yeah. So they're just landscape staples. I got them from a Guckins. So got big cases of them there. 8 inches. And then that is the other beauty about growing in these beds, is that style, when you do that, you have a 5x5 footprint where you can put stakes into wherever you put those arms, wherever you want them to go.
Yeah.
And it's more tedious work, but the yield's higher and it's fun. For me, it's like that's the funnest part. When I get to do that to a table, is like I throw tunes on there. I'm like you're
8 hours in there, and then but not for nothing, you do it over 2 days, and then
you can do whatever you want. You can do a table a night if you want to. You can do 2-3 tables, whatever fits your schedule. And it's like I'm not a large, like I don't have huge rooms in a big grow. So for me, having the smaller space but getting the most out of the area that I can is kind of another reason why.
And you're doing it with minimal plants. You're cranking in, not for nothing. Everything's getting light, so it's all fire. I mean, it's all fire. And, as we'll discuss here in a little while, most of it's going to live resin, which, you're really in it for the oil. Like we're big proponents on this show of, you could grow a big ass flower, and if you get a 3% yield on yours and I get a 6% yield on mine for extract, did it matter that you got that you got all this biomass?
Yeah.
Not really, So, do you notice differences on some of the terpene like I know that your circle, you got a bunch of the homies that you kind of all grow some of the same genetics, and you're running some of their gear as far as blasting it. Do you notice terpene profile differences? Do you notice things where you're like, whoa, this is way louder, or this smells completely different than it does from the homie,
Absolutely. Most of my homies, they all grow hydro or cocoa. It's easy. It works for them. They grow killer weed too. It's just to each their own and what they want to do. Running strains next to each other, I have noticed that the terpene profiles are significantly different depending on strains. Some are pretty similar no matter what it is, and some vary greatly. Like the honey banana is probably one of the most diverse ones I've seen.
Really?
Period. It's like I've smelled sweet candy notes come off of it, and just straight chocolate and earth and everything in between, depending on who grew it, how it was grown, what lights it was under. That one is a super unique one. But there are a lot of like generic ones where like the only thing that varies that much is yield, But in my personal opinion, I think the best terps and the best yields come from a solid living soil versus synthetic.
Yep.
So, and like you mentioned earlier, mine's it's not 100% organic. The liquid nutrients I use, I have a couple synthetics that are in the recipe, but it's mostly most of the inputs are organic, but it's not a full organic.
No, and I think there's, I've discussed it in the past. There's certain people, out there who are like, if it's not living soil, like it's got to be 100%. It's like, no, dude, like plant, I'll never forget. I was working with Phil Haig, and, I ran out of one type of nutrients, and he's like, oh yeah, just use this other line. And I was like, you can do that? And he's like, yeah, they don't give a fuck. Like they're fine, And I think a lot of people, we've been taught over the years that like, they're very sensitive, and they, we had this question on an episode a couple of weeks ago on one of our question episodes, but like I tell people all the time, like, dude, your clones, you can run them pretty full strength, like right off the rip, and they'll take it because again, they're they're copies off of mothers that were being run full strength. So like it's not like there's this babying that needs to be done. And I think a lot of people just, same thing. I don't know when, like, when you lollipop and stuff like that, but I know a lot of people, they're like, oh, you have to wait a couple days before you flip them and this, that, and the other. And it's like, no, dude, they can handle the stress, man. Just run,
That's funny that you bring that up. So when I first was brought into my friend's flower room, and he started teaching me the thinning and the laying them down and getting where they're at, I hadn't been around plants like this. I didn't know what to do. So I was so delicate.
Yeah.
And he saw how delicate I was, and he was like, look, and he had a plant that was like maybe 2 weeks in there, and he took it by the main stem, pulled it 180 degrees flat to the ground and staked it.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, so like once I saw that, and that plant like grew massive.
Yeah.
And so I was like, okay, like, and certain strains will be brittle, and you do need to be more careful with those ones, especially when you're bending them. You need to either like do a twist or whatever to get them. But some of them you can tie them in knots if you want to.
They love the abuse.
Exactly. So it really did, like, you got to kind of know your cultivar, but
we say it all the time on the show. It's just like your kids, like, one kid might like cheeseburgers, the other one doesn't want cheese on his burger, and the other kid doesn't want burgers at all. She wants salad.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? So you got to cater to that. And that's kind of tough. What's your irrigation setup in your room?
So everything's just tapped into a water line. Like we were saying, no RO, just straight water line. And then, it goes down to Dosematic, and then the Dosematic has, the plunger into the food bucket. And then for my, recipe, it's a 50-to-1 mixture, so every 1 gallon and goes into 50. And then I put a gallon flow meter on the watering line, so I know exactly how much. Your girl kicks on the washing machine or something goes on and the pressure drops, it's like you can still see how much is going to each bed. And then I built watering grates, so just four tubes that go down, and then every like 6 inches there's a sprayer head on it that sprays out. So it's pretty easy to know how much each one is getting. Corner tables get like a half gallon less. They're colder, they're not as much light, you know what I mean? So kind of read the room and figure out what's going on. And like, if the nice thing is if there's too much, they bleed out, they leak. So you can really be like, okay, cool, that bed gets.
You have individual valves for each table, so you can kind of.
Yeah, I can't water them all at once, so I like, because the pressure, like they barely come out of the sprayer, so I just do one table at a time. But I mean, it takes 5 minutes to water the whole room. So by doing that and watching the gallon flow meter, it's like you can really like, or if you got a strain where they're struggling or something like that, they're not drinking like the other ones, like they get less. So it's really easy to kind of get everything dialed for each individual table.
Nice. What are some of the challenges that you've faced and had to overcome in living soil, and how did you overcome them?
That earlier room that I showed you, so there was 10 tables in that room and 3 in the other ones. Over the entire 25 years of that house growing in, we only had to switch out 3 tables, and something got in those tables.
Fusarium, Pythium,
something hit those tables, and they were sporadic. It wasn't like it was just one look. It was like 3 random ones. And I tried just because most of the time the living soil will fix itself if there is a problem with it. But 3 rounds, it didn't go anywhere. So we ended up just biting the bullet, pulling the soil out of those beds, put new soil in there. They were good to go.
They were good to go. Yeah. Do you feel like there's a steep learning curve in the learning living soil? I know that, it's all you've ever known, so it's kind of, I think it's almost a difficult question, because when I always say to folks, like, when you learn the hardest way, everything else seems fucking easy.
Yeah.
But what if, for the people who are, because we have an incredible dynamic of listeners, what advice would you have for someone who's beginning living soil?
So like you were saying earlier, I did luck out, and this is how I was taught. So I kind of got around.
Yeah, you hit the ladder. You hit the lottery, bro.
Yeah, pretty much. So, but for people that are just starting, we're living in an incredible point in history where there's so much information that you can really read up and learn it as you go. There's a lot of good info on top dressing mixes that are all organic compounds, and I think that's really where you want to start, because if you do that and you build up your soil well, you can just give them water. You don't have to they'll do better if you give them a nutrient mix, you know what I mean? But you can play around with that on your own and figure things out. But if you have a good top coat mix, you can give the plants straight water and they'll kill it.
How often are you feeding?
Every night.
Night.
It just varies depending on like in veg, those first 4 days of veg, you really want to get the table soaked. Like you want to have a little bit of water come out of whatever, if you're in a pot or a table or whatever. And then after that, once they go into flower, I water them every night, but it's minimal. It'll be like 3.5 gallons per 5x5. So it's not that much. And then by the end, they're drinking 5.5 gallons a night. So.
Nice. What do you think are like some of the misconceptions of living soil as far as, the community out there?
I think most people know that living soil done right is the proper way to do things. Because again, we're trying to mimic the natural plant being outside and in the earth as much as possible. But I think with the cocoa and the rock wool and stuff like that, for people that don't care that much about the whole dynamics of the living soil or really inexperienced, it's easier to follow this exact type recipe situation. But I will say on the benefit side of things, I think that if you're just starting out growing, it's much more forgiving.
Okay, that's a huge, because that I think that would be, honestly, I think that would be the biggest one, because I've always looked at living soil as being too much work and too hard. And from everything you're saying, it's pretty easy.
I think it's easier not switching up, getting new cocoa, getting new stuff every round. And if you don't have issues, the soil gets better and better and better the more that you use it. And I got a funny story. One of our friends back in the day, he grew the same way that we did. He went out of town and he lived up in Netherlands and his power went out. They had a storm. He was out of town for, I think, 10 days, came back. His room was just off, but his plants were still alive, fired everything back up, and his crop continued. It was 10 days later, but his plants didn't die.
That's crazy.
So
they just went into like a stasis.
Yeah, they were just mellowed out. So, and I had an even crazier situation happen to me. That big flood that hit, it was a while.
The Jamestown flood.
Yeah, 6 years ago. whatever it was, whenever that happened.
I think it was almost 10 years
Maybe
ago.
10 years ago.
2015, right?
Is that what it was?
I think 2014.
Yeah, I just remember because my car got messed up and the insurance company, like it had nothing to do with the flood.
Yeah.
But the insurance company wouldn't look at it for like a month because they were dealing with all that flood.
Yeah,
shit.
totally. So it was that same room that you showed earlier. And so those beds were wood. So the new ones I built are steel. They got rollers on the bottom of them. But those beds we built from wood from Home Depot, drilled holes, put PVC in there for drains, and then roofing tarred the inside.
Yep.
So we did that. And then when that flood happened, I had a friend that was looking after my spot. And when I saw on the news, I was in Prague visiting my friend who had recently moved to Prague. And I was like, well, that crop's dusted. You know what I mean? I was like, there was like, I think 2 feet of water in my basement or something like that. And so,
but the benches were high enough.
Well, what happened was they floated. So all the fans blew out in the room and all of those tables were floating in water.
Oh my God.
And the lights were hardwired to the ceiling. So my fans cut off, but the intake outtake fans were on and the lights were on. So those tables were floating in the basement for like a week and a half.
That's crazy.
So the water subsided.
And they're all bottom feeding.
Yeah,
with just a little bit of water.
That's exactly what happened. And I was like, oh, that crop's done. And I got home and they were thriving.
They were rocking and rolling.
Wow.
Yeah. So
holy crap.
The soil is it's much more of a forgiving medium than
I wouldn't have thought that. What advice would you give someone who's considering, because we have a ton of listeners who go back and forth, and I get emails all the time of people who are like, oh, I'm in living soil and I want it to be better. What advice would you give someone who's making the switch from cocoa or hydro over to living soil?
Just research. Like if you hop on YouTube, there's so many like organic farmers that grow fruits and vegetables this exact same way.
Same practices.
So again, back to that top coat situation where it's like you cultivating your soil to be the best that it can be with microbes, earthworms, natural amendments, all of that, and getting that going, even with just water, I think is probably the most important start for anyone making that switch, because there's so many products and lines and everything out there. If you're new to stuff, it kind of makes your head spin. You know what I mean? So I would say start basic, work your way up to adding things that you think is necessary.
What about the guy who's got the 5x5 tent, who doesn't necessarily want to put a whole bed in there? What kind of pot size would you recommend? Because obviously, you know, if I'm doing a pot in a tent and cocoa, it's going to be like 3 gallons. That ain't really going to work with living soil. So what if someone has to do a pot and they don't want to do the bed purely for being able to move stuff around? What size would you recommend for them?
5 gallon.
5 gallon.
So I did a bunch of grows that were the exact same as this style, this method, everything, and they were just in smart pots.
Really?
Yep. So the pinning is a little bit more difficult. You kind of need more bamboo, or if you have a scrog. This was like before scrogs even hit the scene. So it was like we were just trying to get that canopy layer like as best as we could.
I saw some guys in 2011 who did what they called a parabolic scrog. And it was with the old single end hoods, and they would hang the hood right at level. And then the scrog was kind of like this.
I know what you're talking about.
And they would weave the plant through this, but the light would like shine and like it would literally just be a carpet of bud.
Yeah.
And that was where I actually first saw the scrog, was that parabolic scrog.
So I try and get mine like that. I view it as like a satellite dish. So like I let the outside ones come up and do that. So they're just kind of cupping the light.
Yeah.
But yeah, not to that extreme, like where it's like a half pipe, but
yeah, these guys literally, it was like a half pipe.
Yeah,
you know
totally.
I mean? In which I could see you doing that, you know? GRAMBO, you want to slide that up just a little bit more? So where do you see the future of cannabis heading, especially in context of organic, sustainable living soil practices? Because you've been in this a while, and like, you know, like we were talking about before the show, it's always interesting when you see something that you've been doing for a while that really starts catching on, because obviously this is a way for people to differentiate their product from a lot of, I mean, there's so many big farms nowadays just cranking out, quite frankly, Bud Light or Marlboro, that, you know, what you do really differentiates yourself, you know? So, you know, where do you see that kind of going?
Well, like I see the cocoa and the Rockwell seem to be more like designated towards commercial growing. Cause like we were talking earlier, you can get employees that you're like, just do this, and the crops seem to come out the same. But I think those, like the Bud Light analogy used, is kind of like the same thing. Like the personality on the terp, like the weed looks fire, but the terp,
but it ain't there. Yeah, it ain't hitting.
So, and I always go back to this analogy that me and one of my friends were talking about, where they don't really do hydro wine. And what makes the wine is the region that
the terroir, as we like to talk about.
The terroir. Yeah. It was AK was the one who told me that.
Yeah.
And so, you know, in each region, the sun is hitting differently. The weather's different. The humidity, the minerals that are in the dirt that have been there for thousands of years. Those things make those wines individual. And I view the living soil as kind of the same.
Yeah, we discuss that on the show all the time about how Grass Valley and Humboldt County and Floyd, Virginia, and all these different places, you know, have historically grown really fire ass weed. But again, placement of the sun, the soil, the moisture content in the air, how much rain it gets, all these different things, they really do make that. So no, I agree with you completely. Do you have a favorite strain, genetic phenotype that performs really well for you in living soil? Or you're just like, man, this is the best?
Yeah, but I wouldn't attribute it to the living soil necessarily. I attribute it more to the strain.
Is that the red pop or?
The red pop's good. So the new one that I have called Candied Limes.
Yep.
That one really checks all the boxes, where it's super easy to grow. It's got an amazing flower, it makes amazing extract, super good yield, good terp, unique terp. And like I said, it's super easy to grow. So it seems like some of these ones that have these really incredible, unique terps are lacking on a few of the things. Either they don't stretch, they're slow growing in veg, like whatever it is. It's like you got to do that extra just to capture that super unique good. It's just how it is.
It's funny because one of the things I always bitch about is there's just so many people who are selecting on whether it washes nowadays.
Yeah, and
they're really like when you look at. You were just talking about ticking all the boxes. There's a lot of boxes that shit just doesn't tick. It doesn't, it's frosty. Yeah, it's got the sandy glands and stuff like that. But as far as like, is it good flower smoke or is it, does it produce as far as biomass, because you still need biomass to produce resin. Mm-hmm. And it's just like, no. And people are like, oh man, but it washes at 6%. And you're like, yeah, but all like every other factor, it kind of sucks.
Yeah.
And
I mean, I've had strains like that too, where it's like the terp isn't necessarily loud, but it just either makes amazing diamonds or yield super high. Mm-hmm. So like there's definitely like a happy medium to all those types of things. And what's interesting is that like a lot of my friends, my whole other circle of friends, they mostly make rosin and flour. Mm-hmm. And they bring me strains all the time where they're like, amazing terp, didn't wash for shit. See what you can do with it. And it dumps.
Well, and that's something, as when, because you'll have to tune in to episode 2 for that. But that's one of the things I do want to discuss with you is the fact that like, there's all these genetics that wash and then there's everything else.
Yeah.
And I think it's a shame because so many people, because of the stigma and because they're so, quite frankly, obtuse that they can't see past the lack of knowledge, which again, we're going to discuss because I think that's a big problem in the industry is that people are like, oh, rosin's cleaner. We can have a discussion about that, but I don't know that it's cleaner, And so, I think that's one of the big things where like, we're trying, you and I, and a bunch of people that we deal with are trying to bust those myths because it's like, everybody's over here talking about rosin and we're like, hey, there's all these other flavors out here that you guys completely forgot about that taste like watermelon and cherries and fruit punch and all these other things that quite frankly don't wash. You know what I mean? So I kind of, I respect you saying that because I think it's important to recognize that like, hey, different strokes for different folks. Like I say to folks, terpenes are hydrocarbons. Butane is a hydrocarbon. They're all organic. Butane is organic. So anybody who uses the argument, I don't feel like smoking hydrocarbons. Guess what? Terpenes are hydrocarbons. So take that argument and go have it with someone who doesn't understand science.
Yeah.
Can you share a memorable success story or a moment where you were just like, man, this is like the best thing I've ever done, or this is one of the best gardens I've ever fucking had.
So my friend his name was G, that's the guy who taught me how to do all this. He was old legend in Boulder.
Was he in Boulder or was he up in Jamestown?
No, he was in Boulder.
He was in Boulder proper?
Right off of Broadway. So he was like right there on the street.
Nice.
And had an 8-lighter blown up in his garage. Right there.
back when it was cool, but it wasn't cool,
Dude, like I said, he was doing it 30 years before I even came around. So he had been doing this a long time. He used to smuggle, like he flew in the army and he smuggled weed from Jamaica and Colombia to Florida. That was his whole jam.
Crazy.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
He did that. And then,
one of the real ones.
Yeah, he was a real one. And then, it was a pretty crazy story actually. So one of the deals that he had, he was set up. And so like when he was flying into the land on the airstrip, there was DEA waiting for him.
Oh, damn.
So he pulled up, flew off somewhere else, landed in a field, and was just on the run on foot. They chased him for like 3 days. They couldn't find him.
Wow.
So, and I think like 10, 15 years went by after that. He got married, had kids, was on his way to Lyons, just north of Boulder, and got pulled over for speeding. They ran his shit, and he had a warrant out for his arrest.
Damn.
So he got arrested, and he got taken down to Denver and was in jail there for smuggling and doing all that shit. And typical jail story, I guess some dudes came up and they're like, give me your lunch. And he was like, no. Went back to his cell and there was like a crew of dudes waiting for him. They nearly beat him half to death and threw him off the 3rd story.
Damn.
So he broke his back and they were waiting for him to die in the hospital and he never died. So he got out of that, and then he had to eat real healthy because of his medical conditions and all that, and fell in love and met the right people and started growing weed. So that was the thing, is when I went over there, he'd be like, hey, if you're not in a rush, will you give me a hand? I had no intention of growing.
Right,
I was going to be a welder. You know what I mean? And so every time I go there, he'd say, hey, you help me pot these clones? And I was like, sure. All these cool stories. The dude was awesome.
And back then, weed was worth more money than it is nowadays.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, but after that, like I was saying earlier, that 2 months of just hanging out with him and him teaching me everything, it hit a point where he was like, you know how to do everything. He's like, you should probably do a grow. And I was like, I don't think I know it like well enough. And he was like, I'll give you this recipe. And I got a story about the recipe too, but he's like, I will teach you this recipe and you'll have it for the rest of your life. I want 15% of the first crop. I was like, done.
I mean, you're lucky it was only 15% of the first crop.
Oh, yes. Okay.
My partners, it's been.
So the guys that taught him this recipe, this golden ticket recipe, they were NorCal growers forever ago. Some dudes figured out the science, got all the stuff dialed, and they were surfers, I guess. And so they had a friend that came in and he saw what they were doing and he was like, I want to do this. And they were like, all right, we'll teach you how to do this, but we're going to make up, like they made up the nutrients in gallon jugs and they gave them to them. They told them how to use it.
Yeah.
And they were like, so the recipe's $80K and we'll give you this stuff, teach you how to do the grow. And when you pay off the $80K, you'll have the recipe for the rest of your life. And he's like, I don't have that kind of loot. And they're like, you can, as it comes.
Work it.
Whatever.
Yep.
Year or two went by, paid the homies, got the recipe. That somehow trickled down to this circle of dudes and they taught it to me.
I mean, for any of our listeners, man, like that, I mean, everybody complains about what they have to go through to grow flower nowadays. And like, that's how it was back in the day, man, straight up.
Yeah.
And I love hearing stories like that because that's how it was, man. Like nothing was for free. You paid your part, and not for nothing, you didn't tell everybody. It was a circle of homies.
We kept it secret. I mean, we could like
you still keep it secret.
Yeah, I do. And like, that was the thing, is that like, I didn't know anything about growing and I saw what he was doing and was blown away. The first time he took me in, it was like, I think it was a 9-lighter. He had like 3 4x8s or something like that, or 2 4x8s in a row. And like, it looked like a scene out of a movie. I'd never even seen weed growing on a plant before.
And you're still keeping your numbers pretty low because you got 6 plants per bed.
Yeah, exactly. And and once I saw what he was doing, I just shut up and just listened. What he told me was like the word of God to me, because I didn't know any better, which I think worked out in my future. Because I started growing with people who got taught by someone else and they'd be like, no, it's like this, or you got to do it like this. And I had fresh mind where I didn't have any opinions on stuff. I just got taught.
You're like, you're not getting the same results I am.
Yeah. So it's like pretty wild to see how the evolution of that. And like I said, I've stuck with that for 17 years. All the advancements, all the new shit that's come out, I've been doing it the exact same way I was taught for 17 years.
Yep.
So
in that, and in closing on this first part, if you could give one piece of advice to aspiring growers, what would it be, bro?
Go for it. Don't be scared of that's one thing. Be smart and a good neighbor. Keep your yard clean. Keep
don't have broken down cars in front of the house.
Yeah. I mean, like that was one of the things.
Don't have a barking dog.
Don't throw your fucking clones away in your trash. You know what I mean? Like just simple stuff like that. But if you're getting started and you're doing one light and you want to see how it goes, do that. And when you get comfortable, go from there. Don't jump in and be like, I'm gonna do a 50 lighter.
Yeah.
You're probably gonna lose.
I tell people that all the time. Like, you're gonna regret that. Get good. For our listeners, and we were talking about it before the show, but you grew up skating around here and you skated with a bunch of our dudes in the shop who were, the bunch of our guys in the shop were former pro skaters, but you start off with the ollie.
Yeah.
And then you learn the kick flip and then you learn all the other tricks, but you're not doing an impossible your first move.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
And it's like, going back to that other story I was telling, when my friend offered me that, hey, you should do a grow, I'll teach you and, just get 15%. I was super in, and I did it with 2 other of my friends. And my friend's dad had a spot at this apartment complex. And he's like, I'm going to lease you this spot, but I don't know what you're doing in there. All right. Hey, if I get asked anything, no fucking clue. And I was like, all right, cool, go for it. So we threw up a 7-liter between 3 friends, and we did 2 rounds in there. The second round that we did, some jackass gave us a mayo plant, and it seeded the whole fucking thing. And the neighbors were starting to get weird with stuff, so we got out of there. But first crop ever, we pulled like 1.5 pounds, I think 1.75 pounds of light. And that was 17 years ago. And the weed was incredible. At that moment was when I was like, this is what I'm supposed to do. I was working at Discount Tire. I worked at Discount Tire. I was making $10.50 an hour. You know what I mean? And then met this dude. He completely changed my life, showed me, taught me, did all this, did the first round. I was hooked.
So you worked at Discount Tire and done this pretty much.
Yeah. And after the first round came down, I quit Discount Tire. I was out of there. So, and then and this is the other thing that happened. So he had all these spots all over the place, just peppered out throughout Boulder.
Yeah, that was typical story back then. You'd have a guy who probably worked at a grocery store, knew people at a grocery store, had like 5 houses.
Yeah. And
rented out to all the homies.
Yeah.
Been there.
And so he there was all these, in his circle, there was all these old hippie guys that kind of had gotten lazy, and packs were super up, and they were just like doing whatever. I was 20 when I met this dude and started doing this thing. So I got so juiced on the whole situation that I started, not intentionally, but getting all of these houses, because he saw how tenacious I was at doing all this stuff. So you're
just going from house to house to house.
Yeah, and hitting numbers. And he's like, you want
2 hours
this spot?
here, 2 hours here. Yep. And I mean, and a lot of people don't realize, but like you can actually manage that pretty well. And there's lots of dudes who have where, 20 lights in one house, 20 lights in the next. And you're rotating throughout town and making it happen. And, again, back then,
so it was.
Peas were $4 or $5 grand.
Yeah.
Well, dude, thank you for coming in today. And, we got this first part. Tune in again, because the next part, we're going to talk about completely different shit, because he's a single source maniac. So tune in for the next episode with the diamond mine. We'll be back.